Hey, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. On this episode we're looking at one of the Sega Genesis launch titles. It's a continuation on one of my favorite rail shooter series. Today we're checking out Space Harrier 2, developed and published by Sega, releasing exclusively to the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive in 1988. This along with Alter Beast will be some of the first titles to hit the console. This will receive a handful of ports on a few microcomputers like the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and the MSX, but we'll be focusing on the Genesis version for this video. Let's get ready and check out this chapter's story. The Harrier returns to the Fantasyland after receiving a distress signal from its 214th sector. The Harrier then slips through the Cosmic Gate and makes landfall to battle the hordes of galactic enemies once again, in pursuit of the infamous Dark Harrier. Their legions are massive, and with their equally powered leader, the battle is about to be fierce. Charge up your laser cannon and get ready. We're going back to the Fantasy Zone. Gameplay-wise, much like the original, we've got a 2D on-rail shooter where you can stay in the skies or run along the ground at the speed of a bullet train. Same rules still apply from the previous entry as well, with only one hit before crashing back to the surface. Your only weapon is your cannon, and once again it will shred through your ops like a finely sharpened saw blade. Through 13 stages you'll traverse the Fantasyland and rid it of the creatures contained within. As you make your way through each stage, you'll encounter waves of enemies leading up to its main boss, all of which are pretty unique this time around. Enemies also come into the frame from both directions this time, now being able to spawn behind you and boomerang towards you on their way out. This makes the combat a bit more frenetic than last time, and the result of some exciting encounters as you weave through the stage hazards and try to blast as much as you can to rack up points. Some stage hazards are destructible like trees and shrubs, but pillars and pylons remain solid and you can collide with them if you aren't careful. Unique to this entry, you can also choose your starting stage but have to finish the first 12 stages before going on to the final stage, being a boss rush and eventual showdown with the Dark Harrier. Bonus stages return with a similar concept to the first game, though instead of riding the Uriah, you ride a personal rocket glider as you down as many enemies and parts of the surrounding as possible to build score towards extra lives. Boss fights here are one of the main attractions with Space Harrier 2, throwing in some battles akin to the predecessor, while adding in some more intricate attack patterns and agile foes as you enter each encounter. These start off relatively simple, though the further you go, the more difficult these bosses become. All of them can clap you quickly, but with well-placed shots and some pattern recognition, you can cook these bosses just as fast. Graphics-wise, Space Harrier 2 looks solid for an early Genesis release, being one of the 6 launch titles to hit the console in 1988. A similar visual style is used much like the original, with a few changes compared to its arcade predecessor with how it handles the playfield. You can move along all 8 axes, though in Space Harrier 2 you don't get quite as much room on the horizontal axis as you did in the arcade, but there is still some. This also moves at a steady frame rate along the journey without much in the way of slowdown even when the screen is getting hectic. A few of the enemies from Space Harrier 1 return, like the mechanical orbs, and the first dragon makes an appearance, along with a slew of new enemies amongst the Fantasyland. You'll see a bit of a medieval theme mixed in with various creatures about, such as giant jellyfish, mechanized mobile suits, spaceships, and even a few humanoids. The attack formations have some similarities to the original while not using the same style of sprite scaling. While that is the main visual difference some may notice, the sequel still handles the visual effect well despite it being done a little bit differently. Common enemies spawn in as high as formations of 6, and when the doubles roll in, the screen can get bucked with the quickness. The environment also plays into the viewpoint leading into the screen, and this all looks smooth and retains the parallax scrolling from the arcade coin-op. The theming of each stage is actually pretty interesting to note since it moves from the lush outskirts of the Fantasyland to more derelict future cities. There's also a fair bit of Egyptian and Greco-Roman type architecture in the backgrounds, which is nicely detailed. You also get a few of the enclosed levels where the floor and ceiling share the same texture, and these still also look sick. Boss designs are really sick here, also leaning into the Egyptian and Greek mythology theming. The Medusa encounter is a memorable one, watching the facial transformation before the battle starts, and the wizards and Batwing Tiger are rad encounters. Some bosses also have small intros of sorts before each battle commences, and these parts look dope. Bosses have some solid variety, even with a couple of mid-boss appearances from the first game. Like the original, bosses change color, visually displaying damage and explode once defeated. Encounters also get pretty frantic with flurries of bullets and projectiles on screen, and the encounter with the mechanical orbs throws nearly a couple dozen on screen at once. Visually, it's a smooth playing experience for the most part, though it doesn't quite feel as fast as the original arcade version. Mimicking the scaling effect from the arcade was a solid workaround and showcases an assortment of environments and enemies, while bringing that arcade feel to the home consoles. Even when the screen gets bucked with enemies, it never really hits heavy slowdown, and for an early Genesis entry, it certainly holds its own. Sound-wise, Space Harrier is a trendsetter for the system, being one of the first Genesis games to use speech synthesis. The vocal cues from the original are elevated with more crisp and bassy delivery, even though there are less voice lines. The Harrier still says "get ready" as you respawn when downed, and the battle cry of taking a hit is amplified several notches with its audio rework. Enemies also have a specific signal when spawning into the playfield, letting you know when danger is afoot. In-game audio, like firing your weapon, is a slightly more muted sound compared to the original, but it does have that familiar feel. Shots also have an audio indicator if it's something you can't shoot or pass through, so when you hear a clash, either dodge or wait for the attack window to open up. The soundbite for when bosses are taking damage also sounds pretty similar to the upcoming Ghostbusters game developed by Compile. Explosions also have some pretty clean audio, making each boom sound satisfying, especially when dropping bigger enemies. The standout is the music though, with yet another set of belters as you navigate the Fantasyland. Fantasyland. Composer Tokuhiko Iwabo lays down several bangers throughout the game, and each boss has their own individual tune, and there's a few in here that smoke. The main theme as you go through the 13 stages also has several bridges and crescendos on your travels, so it's cool to hear the progression of the main tune just to be followed up by even bigger boss tunes. Space Harrier 2 is an awesome follow-up to the arcade coin-op, even if it doesn't hit quite all the same highs as its predecessor. You get new stages and several unique bosses with sick designs and animations, all that with the original feel from the first game. It makes you wonder what an arcade version of this may have been like had it not been a console exclusive. Considering had this had the superscalar tech fully enabled, it could have been insane. It's still a worthy sequel and is a fun rail shooter to run through for either clears or going for new personal best scores. The difficulty is balanced and will be challenging to get through, though once you're comfortable with the controls and sightlines, you'll be clapping up most everything in the Fantasyland. Space Harrier 2 gets an 8 out of 10 and comes recommended to on-rail shooter fans as well as fans of adventure games, since this one is quite the ride. This is amongst the better rail shooters on the system and would influence later titles like Namco's Burning Force, which also appeared on the Genesis and Mega Drive a few years later. Its challenge is equally matched by its fun factor, and running through its hard mode is a true test for those who seek the mission. This is available on the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive for about $12 to $17 for loose copies, and around $20 to $40 for complete copies currently. This one is a staple for the Sega Genesis and certainly deserves a spot in your collection for rail shooter fans and beyond. And thank you again if you made it this far into the video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you use this as a resource. Check back often, we'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future. But until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.